Hello and welcome back for another episode of this season of Try This on Wisp Sports. I'm your host, Dr. Kirstin Lauritsen, and I am so excited for today's episode because it's going to be a big one. I'm going to talk a lot about my favorite topic, which is gut health and also food sensitivities, but I'm going to talk about them in the perspective of my training, where I'm at right now, and in the perspective of what I've been dealing with since Ironman Coeur d'Alene and some other things as well, which are going to be very good learning lessons for anybody who has done any or will do in the future any races in extreme conditions like Ironman Coeur d'Alene with 100+ degree heat. So this is going to be a really awesome, really big episode. So before we dive in though, to that, we are going to talk a little bit about where I'm at right now, because there's a couple of short and cute little learning lessons that we'll talk about in the perspective of where I am in my training right now. And then we'll dive into that main bit after this. So couple of things. So first off, where I'm at in my training block right now is we are 2 weeks out, I think. Yeah, we're 2 weeks out from Ironman Indian Wells in La Quinta in Palm Springs, and that's December 5th. And so that's been the training block that I've been training for this last couple of months, while also trying to somehow put training and recovery and all of that together. And I actually think that this was a good fit. At first I was wondering, and you'll understand why I was wondering if this was actually a good idea in a bit when we talk about all of this. But I was wondering if maybe this race was a little bit too close and I was pushing my body a little bit too hard to try to get ready for this race. But my coach and I did a really good job, I think, at keeping expectations and also putting in training that wasn't going to overload my system too much. And I'm going in feeling really, really strong, which is a really, really nice feeling, because for a little bit there, just about a month ago, I was starting to get a little bit nervous that I was not going to be prepared for this race. And I was like, okay, it's going to be another one of those. But luckily we're okay. So we're 2 weeks out. So, this is the time in the training blocks, I feel like, where it's just a lot to try to, there's just so much training, right? And it's not that heavy, but I can just feel the load on my system a little bit, that we're really trying to get to that. We're at the peak, right? We're at the peak of that training block. And so I only have one more huge week left, of training, and then it'll be the taper week, and it'll be traveling down to Palm Springs. So I'm really excited about where I'm at. I'm feeling I had a really solid run on Sunday where I just felt strong, and we incorporated a lot of walk breaks. So it was an hour 10 workout, long run. And, I got really lucky because it was like really, really, really sunny here. So I really, really enjoyed the run, but it was like really cold. So I had like my beanie on and I had my sunglasses. And so it was actually a really enjoyable run. And we did a 4-minute run with a 1-minute walk for the whole time, which was actually really cool because I still ran, let's see. So for the what are they called? So 10K, for the 10K that I did in like just a couple of weekends ago, I did that 6.5 miles in 57 minutes, I think. And for this run, I still made it, for an hour 10, I still made it 6.5 miles. So it was a little bit shorter or a little bit longer than that 10K where I ran solid all the way through, but I had walk breaks. So that to me felt like a really, really solid run, because I knew in the 4 minutes that I was running, I was really running solid, and I knew that I was running really well. So that mentally was really, really nice to see. We also swam in Lake Oswego here in Oregon, which, by the way, is freezing. So it's 51 degrees in that water. So our main goal, especially for Indian Wells, which is, the race that's coming up in 2 weeks, the biggest thing that they always talk about is that, they always, like, people ask me when I say, oh, I'm doing Indian Wells, they go, oh, well, how are you going to prepare for the cold water? So the main goal of swimming in this very cold water in Lake Oswego was to just get ready for that race, because the water in Lake Oswego was 51 degrees. I mean, just so cold. But the water in Indian Wells in La Quinta is supposed to be like 57 degrees. But keeping in mind that, it'll be 60 degrees ish in the air instead of 40. So anyway, and don't worry, like we did everything, with all the safety precautions and all the things. But anyway, so this weekend training was really, really solid. And my swimming training has been really good. But the reason why I want to bring this up is because one of the things that I've been noticing over the last few days, even though I had a really, really solid run, I went to my swim this morning and my body's tired. So I'm keeping that in mind, obviously, in the back of my head. But in previous episodes, like way, way back towards the beginning, there were many episodes where we talked about how to train within your cycle. So for people who menstruate, the biggest thing is paying attention and tracking your cycle. And I'm not going to go into the details of all of that, but because you can go back and you can listen to some of those episodes if you weren't here at that time, or if you would like to revisit those, feel free. But there are two phases of the cycle. There's the first phase, which is the follicular phase, and the second phase, which is the luteal phase. But what usually happens within like a couple of days ish, like 3 to 4 days of when you start the period, there is a tendency for the body for women's bodies, obviously, or for people who menstruate, that those few days before the period can feel like your workouts, like you're just not able to reach those higher intensities. It just feels like you're kind of dull almost. Like it's just, like it's hard to like reach the intensity that you are usually training at. And I mention this because number one, I feel like, and I don't know this for sure, but I feel like the feeling of that is way more exaggerated when you're deep into a training block. Like, I don't feel like I notice the difference between flat days in like the luteal phase compared to the follicular phase as exaggerated or as much towards the beginning of a training block. But when I'm fatigued and tired, and then, because we're getting towards race day, and you're trying to really build those adaptations up, I just feel like sometimes those flat days before the period definitely are a little bit more exaggerated in this time of the training block. Now, that's just an observation I've made. I don't actually know for sure if that is a pattern that a lot of other people see. But the reason I mention it is just because it's so important to remember. And this is why it's really important to track as well, is that, if I wasn't tracking, I might be thinking to myself like, oh, I'm really nervous and I'm not feeling very good about going into Indian Wells because like today at swim practice, I just felt so slow. Well, it's not necessarily an issue because I actually know that in a couple of days, I'm going to start my period. And so like, it's nothing to freak out about. In fact, this is a great day to show up, do the training. And instead of feeling like I really need to push the intensity and push myself, just show up and do the training and just show up where your body is able to show up today, and then call it good. Don't get all wrapped up in like your thoughts and emotions and things about it when it's not really necessary. Right. So that is where we're at. I'm really, really excited about where I feel right now and where I'm setting up. I also am going to have, for the first race this year, I'm going to be in that follicular phase. So my body should be able to deal with some of the extremes a bit of the cold water. And then also if it does get a little bit warm towards that noon to midday-ish, I should be able to handle that a lot better than in the luteal phase where I was for all my other hot races this summer. So I'm really, really, really looking forward to this race. So yeah, I just feel like I'm set up really well. So we're going to get into the main bit here as far as talking about gut health and food sensitivities, and also a few lessons that I've learned since Coeur d'Alene. We're going to talk about a little bit about what I've been dealing with since those big races, and since now I kind of have a better understanding of what I've been going through, and we'll get back into that right after this. So what we kind of need to do in order to get into this next bit here is to kind of rewind a little bit. So for those of you that don't know, I did Ironman Coeur d'Alene in June of this year. It was my first full Ironman, and it was a doozy of a race. It was 108 degrees, and it was that hot on my second loop of the bike out. So it was very, 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 very hot that day. And I overheated on the bike. I also overheated on the run as well. And so it just was a really, 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 really tough day. Now, one of the things that I've learned since then is in those extreme heats like that, well, first off, let's keep in mind. So with any endurance race, so any Ironman, any long endurance like ultra run or anything like that, it's very common, and it's like most athletes will deal with some version of this, which is called intestinal permeability or leaky gut. It's essentially where the intestinal lining starts to either the protein gets pulled from it, so it starts to form some leaky gut, or it's just from the kind of stress of those events that starts to form this process. And there's a lot of things that you can do to try to delay it, but at a certain point, almost every athlete will deal with this. And it's just how your body handles it that some people just don't notice any problems at all. So to bring us back to that intestinal permeability and what it is, before we kind of go any further, intestinal permeability, if you were like to take your hands into fists and then put them together side by side, picture one fist, one hand is a cell that is that makes up the GI tract lining, and the other fist right next to it is another cell. These cells are supposed to be super tight together. They're not supposed to like come apart at all, right? Because they form that barrier between the outside world and your bloodstream and immune system and your inside world. So the thing that happens, though, is when things get a little bit inflamed in that GI tract lining, then it can start to cause those two cells to start to pull apart a little bit. So picture just like loosening up a little bit in between your fists. And then what can happen is things like undigested food particles, toxins, bacteria, all of that can get in between the cells. And then that's when it starts to launch this major immune response to fight that. And we'll talk about the implications about that in a little bit. But that is essentially the process of what leaky gut is. Now, the other thing that can cause leaky gut is when you are in those like endurance races, the body doesn't have a very good way of storing protein, right? So like it obviously does store it in the muscles, and you have some free floating around, and you have a little bit in the GI tract lining. So what happens is the muscles so when the body runs out of protein, it will start to break down the muscle tissue, which is step number one. And that's how we end up getting that kind of like delayed onset muscle soreness, and fatigue is from that breakdown and then that, rebuilding process. But the other thing that the body will do, and especially in those longer endurance races, is it will start to pull from the GI tract lining, and it'll start to pull the protein from there, which is not ideal, right? So this process happens, and it's just how it goes. Now, most athletes, though, after an Ironman race will heal that up in about a week. It's kind of part of the recovery process. You can go back also to another episode that we did talking about the recovery after an Ironman. That was a really awesome episode as well to go back to. But those sorts of things are what happens during these longer events. Now, if you then also put an athlete in extreme heat, that gets exaggerated even more so. So, number one, it's really good to go into races like that as healthy as you possibly can, because it can be so stressful on the body. But because I also got heat exhaustion on top of that, it created a very big inflammatory issue for me that I didn't entirely realize until later. So then 3 weeks later, I did the July Half Ironman here in Salem, Oregon, and it got hot again. And that was a little bit like the icing on the cake. It was stressful for my body. And we knew it again that was probably not a good thing. So then 3 weeks later, 3 to 4 weeks later, I did Hood to Coast, which is a relay race that is a 24-hour race that you are running, lengths and distances over a period of time and then sitting a lot of time in the car. That race, the first run that I did, I overheated. And so at the end of that race, I knew that something wasn't quite right. I went to bed that evening. And I woke up the next morning, and I haven't talked about this on this podcast. So here we go. I woke up the next day and I was laying in bed and I started I was itchy. I was like really, really itchy. And I'm like itching my back. And I start to feel that there are bumps there. And I was like, well, that's kind of weird. So, and I realized I was really itchy, not kind of just I was really itchy. So I get up, I get out of bed, I go to the mirror, and I have hives, not just red dots. I have massive hives from my sacrum to my head. And I was like, oh my gosh. So that was Sunday. I couldn't get in to see a doctor or anything like that. I was taking Benadryl. I was trying all sorts of things all day Sunday, trying to deal with this itchiness. I spent all day on the couch. I had hives that went not only across my back, but they went all the way down my legs, and then also went across my abdomen as well. And they were headed into my face. It was so awful, and just itchy all over the place. Come to find out that if for anybody listening, if this ever happens to you, I hope it never happens to you. But Benadryl is only one type of antihistamine. So it will help with kind of easing some of the itchiness, but it didn't really help a ton. What actually helped more was a different type of antihistamine, which was essentially, I think, what Claritin is, or Zyrtec. It's called loratadine. That's its actual name. But you can try different antihistamines if one isn't working. So that was a really big learning lesson for me. But the whole point of that, though, is that those hives were, and I also got steroids for that as well, because I needed my body to calm down. That's a huge, huge, huge inflammatory response. Okay. So after those 3 events, essentially what had happened was this was a huge stress on my system. And I kept layering on these massive stressors, right? That were it was brutal for my body. So I knew after that one of the things I had to do was focused on rest and recovery and trying to fight that inflammation as best as I possibly could. So for the rest of the time after that, I was taking a lot of anti-inflammatories, lots of antioxidants. So talking about things like vitamin C, vitamin E, turmeric, tons of fish oil, high doses of fish oil, 4 grams of fish oil. So really, really high. Vitamin D, putting in as much as I possibly could of really healthy, good fruits, vegetables, really good quality protein. Those were standard, and also trying to stay as hydrated as possible, which isn't always easy. So there were a lot of ups and downs in that. And then for about a whole month, I was hardly training at all. And then October hit and it was time to start really consistently training. And I was a mess. Oh man, I was such a mess. That first week of October, I was I remember talking to my coach being I can't do this. I was getting onto that bike trainer and I was barely lasting 20 minutes. So there was a lot going on there. Now what I've come to learn though, so first off, that leaky gut piece, there's a lot that needs to be done to help heal that. And I wasn't only doing, I just remembered, I wasn't just doing antioxidants, anti-inflammatories. I was also doing and adding in a lot of something called L-glutamine. L-glutamine is L-glutamine is a protein, an amino acid. There we go. All the A's is an amino acid that is really effective at helping to heal leaky gut, to helping to heal that GI tract lining. So that played a pretty critical role in helping to get me feeling better. And by beginning of November, at that point, I was starting to feel a little bit normal, but I was still getting this leftover itchiness. And what was happening is I would just get I would notice I would come home at the end of the day after maybe kind of a stressful-ish day. And I was noticing that sometimes my hands would get red and then they get really itchy, or maybe sometimes I would be itching, my legs and my skin would just be so itchy. And it was really, really uncomfortable. There were a few times I was in the pool, and especially when there was a time there where the pool got really hot, and we did keep it really easy for those because our core temperatures basically would have been way too high if we were actually doing a hard swimming session in 81 degree water or something like that. Anyway, I think it was warmer than that. Anyway, and I noticed even in there, I started getting itchy. Well, then what I started noticing is instead of these all over body hives, which was the only one time that I actually had that. But then I started getting this okay, so I'd get a little bit itchy. And then I would start to notice that it was a red patch, and then it looked like raised goosebumps. And I thought, man, that's super interesting. And they weren't consistent, right? They came on every once in a while. And then sometimes I'd just take an antihistamine for it, which if you've been listening to this podcast, you know that taking an antihistamine can delay your adaptations to exercise, as well as the supplements and antioxidants and anti-inflammatories that I was taking as well. So these are some really critical things to talk about today, and some concepts that I really want to drive home. Is that, yes, all of those things are true. But if you are so inflamed, which I'm raising my hand right now, right? I fit that description. My body was super inflamed. And I still wanted to do this half Ironman at the end of the year. So what I did was I set my expectations to be, if I feel like I am not good, and if I'm not feeling good and strong by 2 weeks out from the race, then we need to be very intentional and really take a hard look at whether or not this is a good idea to do. Because what I don't want to do is put a very stressful day on top of a very inflamed body if I'm not able to get this under control by then. And because that's just going to, that just is the worst thing, because now it's going to delay, getting back into training afterwards again, right? By a lot. And I didn't want to potentially trigger something so bad that it now is going to take me a long time to recover from that. Right. So here's the point. Yes, you can use Advil. Yes, you can use anti-inflammatories, antioxidants. Yes, you can use antihistamines. You can use all of those things, especially if you need to get yourself comfortable. Being itchy all over your body is it's an awful feeling. So yes, I will take the antihistamines when I need them. But the goal, though, is to get to a point and to figure out what's causing that and why that's continuing to stay around. So here's the learning lesson of this whole thing. That redness that I was talking about with those goosebumps that get really itchy, that look a little bit weird. What I needed to do was I needed to clear the smoke or clear the static. Picture listening on the radio and, it's staticky. And as soon as the static clears, you're able to hear now. You're able to hear what's on the radio or listen what's being broadcasted over the radio. That scenario is the same thing of where I am right now. Yes, I did continue training, but we took my training very carefully. I did not push myself very hard in some of those workouts. I bailed on a ton of workouts, and I also spent a lot of days not training and recovering, which mentally is difficult because I knew I wanted to be ready to go for this race, but I also knew that if I pushed too hard, I was running the risk of maybe not even being able to do the race at all. So what I learned now that I've cleared the smoke of it and I've been using those anti-inflammatories and antioxidants and yada, yada, is that now what I can see, since now like the inflammation has dropped down a little bit more, I'm able to pay attention a little bit more to really what's going on. And I've realized that what is causing a lot of that itchiness that is lingering is gluten. And I know for some of you, you're going to be like, oh, well, everybody has said that, gluten isn't that bad of a thing. And there's tons of studies now that are showing that, people can eat gluten. And if you avoid gluten, it can cause more problems. And I know all of those things. However, the thing that you want to keep in mind is that this is why it's so important to listen to your body. And this is what we do in my office, is that when somebody comes in and they've got all, like, essentially picture me, right, as a patient coming in and saying, I just went through this like crazy stressful thing. I am getting this I got these like hives all over my body. And now I'm still continuing to like have some itchiness and I'm still feeling like I'm not recovering. Put all of that together, you clear the static, clear the smoke, and then now you're able to see, oh, gluten seems to be like it's a trigger, because I can listen and I can see the patterns. Okay. The thing that I want you to keep in mind is we're going to go back to what is that intestinal permeability? Do you remember from just a little bit ago? So that intestinal permeability is where the cells of the gut get a little bit leaky. What happens when anybody gets exposed to gluten, whether you are sensitive to it or not? Gluten enters the body. There's a lot of different proteins that you can be sensitive to, but gliadin is the one that's the most commonly known. So gliadin gets close to those GI tract cells. And what the cells do in response to that is they release something called zonulin. Zonulin is an inflammatory chemical that will then literally causes leaky gut. And this happens in every single person when they eat gluten. But the thing is that for most people who don't have issues with their GI tract, they will heal that up in about an hour, maybe 2. But for people who have an inflamed gut and then are eating gluten maybe 2 to 3 times a day, or if they have an inflamed gut because of some other stressor, which would be me, and all of the things that I did, right? And if there's any issue going on with like the bacteria that are in there, I mean, there's so many different things, right, that can come back from that. But zonulin essentially will release in response to gluten, and then that your body may not be able to heal that up in 1 to 2 hours. In fact, it might take you a full day, or it might take you a week, or it might take you a month. Or in the case of like some people who have celiac or Crohn's or any type of autoimmune disease, it might take a month to 6 months to a year after one exposure to heal up that leaky gut. That is why it's so critical to understand how these foods are physiologically interacting with your body, and then understanding where you're at, so that first off, we can clear the smoke, clear the static, so we can listen and hear what it is. And then we can see if there's a food or if there's something else that may be causing why your symptoms are still there. So it's not just gluten that can do this, right? It's also things like dairy, or it could be sugar, or it could be any food that you have been exposed to. And so this is the second piece here that is food sensitivities. So gluten for me is not necessarily going to be a long-term thing that I have to avoid. It's one thing that I'm going to cut out now for about 4 to 6 weeks. And then I will reintroduce and see if that itchiness or those things come back. Because I recognize that this is likely not necessarily a sensitivity per se that's going to turn potentially into an allergy. This is just my body responding, and it's causing inflammation, and I need to get my immune system to calm down. One of the things though that can happen though is because, so this is me in 4 months post big race, post all of this stuff happening. And I'm recognizing this immediately, right? a lot of patients come to me, or a lot of athletes come to me 4 years, 6 years, 8 years after having all of these things. At that point, if you've done nothing to try to clear some of this stuff up and try different things, then so like gluten, for example, could turn into a full blown like sensitivity that I might have to avoid forever at this point. Right. So there's a reason why it's really important to get on top of some of this stuff as quickly as you possibly can. That being said, one of the reasons why athletes get, or people in general get, food sensitivities, and this is why things like Brussels sprouts or broccoli or beans or garlic or onions or any of these foods that you would typically think are healthy, or rice, right? Like foods that you would typically consume on a normal daily basis and not consider to be bad for you to eat per se, right? Sometimes people form food sensitivities because of this process. So what happens, remember that leaky gut. So those cells are sitting right up next to each other and they start to get a little bit separated. So those undigested food particles can make their way in between the cells. What happens is your body has to launch an immune response to that. Okay. Because food that's undigested is not usable by the body. The body uses things like amino acids. It uses things like vitamins and minerals. It uses things like essential fatty acids. Those are the building blocks and the things that the GI tract breaks your food down into so that you can absorb and use. It doesn't deal very well with egg white. That's like what you see on your plate, right? It doesn't deal with that very well. So, and it doesn't have anything to break down, to break all of that down when it's on the other side of your GI tract lining. So what happens is that food particle, that rice or that rice piece or that egg white, it gets into your bloodstream, and 60 to 70% of your immune system is at the level of the gut. So what does it do? It launches its immune response. It creates antibodies, which then triggers your immune system, which can then trigger a ton of different types of inflammatory markers, which then leads to inflammation in many different places, right? So, and then on top of that, because you're launching antibodies to all of that food, this is where those food sensitivities can start up. So you might eat a lot of rice in your diet. You might eat a lot of broccoli. You might eat a lot of all these different things. And if you have leaky gut going on and it's perpetually going on, like your gut lining isn't healing, then you can potentially end up forming food sensitivities to those foods. And then that is just causing more inflammation. Now we can take all of this a step further and picture if you have that happening, right? Like you have that leaky gut and you have that inflammation going on at the gut lining, and then also that heightened immune response. What can then happen is that blood that's dealing with all of that, plus some of the endotoxins and other things that can come in through. These are going to be big terms, but don't worry so much about them. They're called lipopolysaccharides. We can call them LPS for short, but they're basically toxins that can leak from inside the GI tract into the bloodstream and trigger your immune system. And then what we've seen is in studies is that blood that's dealing with all of that at your GI tract, well, guess where that goes? It goes everywhere. It goes to your joints. It goes to your brain. It goes to all of your organs. And what we've started to see is that that inflammatory blood is leading to injuries in athletes. We've seen several research studies now that are showing how the inflammation from the GI tract is leading to joint injuries. That's huge, right? So if we take a step back now and we look at, okay, from start to finish, this is where we're at. What I've realized at this point now in my journey, which is why I'm sharing it now, is that from start to where the hives really started to now, I did a lot of things to try to counteract and counterbalance this so that I can actually go and race and be healthy on race day. But I wouldn't have been able to do that if I wasn't trying to get that inflammation knocked down, if I wasn't trying to heal my gut. And now finally I'm realizing that gluten is kind of a big piece for me right now. So I'm going to make the changes to avoid that. And I think I should maybe put a caveat on that too, that like, I don't eat a ton of bread and I don't eat a ton of pastas and gluten and things like that anyway, but they do show up, they do show up in sourdough toast, and they do show up in some certain types of bars that I'll eat before I go swim, because it's just a really quick and easy way to get food. So I'm not working out fasted. There's a lot of things where gluten can sneak its way in. And for most of the time, that's okay if you're doing things to counteract and counterbalance that, and it's not causing inflammation or an issue. But if you have a test or a panel that's showing that you don't do well with gluten, or if you have autoimmune disease, or you have other kind of inflammatory issues that are not going away, it's worth looking into some of these things. But sometimes a food sensitivity panel won't tell you everything, and they're not always very reliable. But what is reliable is clearing the smoke or clearing the static and listening to what's going on and actually allowing your body to tell you what's wrong and paying attention to what those signals are. And instead of getting wrapped up in like, oh no, like now I'm not going to be able to eat bread. Well, if you actually deal with it now, then you actually might be able to bring bread back in 4 to 6 to 8 weeks, right? 2 months. Anybody can do anything for 2 months. But if you don't do anything about it, then that's where things can start to get worse and worse and worse. And the last thing I'll say is that leaky gut, intestinal permeability, is one of the things that is a trigger for autoimmune disease. So if you have that, and I know that in my family history, I have autoimmune disease in my family tree. So for me, it's really, really, really important and really critical that I deal with this now, because I don't want it to trigger something later down the road. So all of those things wrapped up in a nice little bow, where I am at now, and why we started out this episode with how really awesome I'm feeling at this point in going like 2 weeks out from this Ironman, Half Ironman, is that I'm very, very, very thrilled to be where I am right now, and that I'm feeling really solid going into that race, because I was going to potentially drop out if I didn't feel like my body was where it needed to be to race well. And that it wasn't going to cause like a huge amount of stress on my system, in the perspective of what I literally just dealt with over the last 3 months. Right. So I hope that this episode is helpful for anybody out there who's been dealing with any of these types of issues, but also just understanding that being an endurance athlete is an inflammatory endeavor. Actually, being an athlete in general is an inflammatory endeavor. So it's really, really, really important that we take that into perspective, and we think about what are the daily habits and routines that I have, that I'm doing or that I'm not doing, that are potentially working against me. And how can we make sure that we're doing the right things to get you set up and get you to race day feeling really strong and really healthy? For some of you, if you are starting out your training block already inflamed, then keeping those anti-inflammatories and antioxidants and some of those things in is going to be really critical. And also making sure that you're building in enough rest days so that you actually get your body to mop up that inflammation and recover. And then we don't necessarily worry so much about getting those really strong adaptations to exercise. Like, yeah, we're going to have some delays there, but we mentally get ourselves ready for that. Versus if we have somebody who has done the prep work and is ready to go into their next training block and is not inflamed, is all their nutrients are topped off and they're really in a solid place, we can send them into their next training block without the antioxidants and anti-inflammatories, so that we can really get as much out of those adaptations as possible. Really trying to get the most out of the body and really trying to get everything from that training that we can squeeze out of it, essentially. Those are two very different people, right? Those are two very different scenarios. But what we don't hear is those two different scenarios. What we hear is everybody needs to be taking supplements or everybody needs to be doing it this way or everybody needs to be doing it that way. And we don't hear enough of, hey, let's actually get some really good labs run. Like, for example, I ran a GI lab so I could really see what was going on. And I learned a lot about what was happening inside my body that I already knew, but I got a little bit more details as far as what was also going on with my immune system. You get the labs run, if you have time before you start your next training block, this is, if you're going to start your training block in January, like this is the time, top off, get that inflammation down, top off those vitamin and mineral levels and amino acids, and make sure that your diet's all dialed in and on point and you're sleeping enough so that you can really get yourself ready to go. So that when January hits, like you can take advantage of that entire training block, So that's been the journey. That's been what I've been dealing with over the last couple of months. And I'm really, really excited to be where I'm at today. I've worked really hard to be here, which is why feeling how solid I have felt in the last week or two, has been a really, it's just been a very, very good feeling, knowing that I'm going to be able to head into this race and know that like I'm going to be fine, right? And not only that, but I'm going to be able to start training afterwards, give myself a little bit of recovery and a little bit of a break, but I can still ease my way back into recovery and not necessarily have like a month or two of just struggle. Let's try and avoid that, shall we? Okay. Well, that's our episode for now. Thank you so much for listening. What would be really helpful? If you liked this episode, I would love it if you would maybe share it with somebody that you think could really benefit from it. Or what would also be really helpful is on Apple Podcasts and even on Stitcher and probably some of the other apps out there as well. You can rate this podcast and you can also leave a review. And that really helps get these episodes out to more people. So that if you could do that for me, that would be awesome. And I would really, really appreciate that. The other thing you can do too is you can make sure to follow Wisp Sports on all social media channels. And then also you can follow me at Dr. Kirstin on Facebook and Instagram. And also you can find me at drkirstin.com. If you'd like to reach us with any comments or questions about the episode, you can at info@wispsports.com. And you can always leave a direct message with us over on social media as well. So thank you for listening, and I will be back next week. Take care.